My wife said, "You're going to be surprised." She said it with a smile. But something about that smile made me stop what I was doing. I had been married to Dana for 31 years, and I knew the difference between her ordinary smile and the one she wore that evening. This one looked like she was carrying a secret. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through some old bills, when she walked into the room and placed a small envelope beside my hand. "What's this?" I asked. She shook her head and smiled. "Open it later." I laughed. "Dana, you know I hate surprises." She leaned against the counter and said, "This one is different. You're going to be surprised." I looked at the envelope again. There was no return address, no explanation, and my name was written across the front in Dinah's handwriting. For most of our marriage, surprises had meant simple things. A birthday dinner, a family trip, a gift for one of the children, something harmless. But this time I could tell she was nervous. Our daughter, Millie, had recently moved into a new apartment, and our son, Robert Dolan, had started spending more time helping with his work. Life had become quieter for Dana and me. We had reached that stage of marriage where the children no longer needed us every day, and we were learning how to live with the empty spaces they had left behind. I thought perhaps Dana had planned a vacation. Maybe she wanted to surprise me with a trip for our anniversary. I started guessing, and she laughed. "You're getting warmer." "So it is a trip?" I asked. "Maybe." "A new car?" "Definitely not." "Then what?" She picked up the envelope and held it against her chest. "You'll find out tomorrow." I stared at her. "Tomorrow?" She nodded. "I need you to trust me." That sentence made me curious. Dinah had never been good at keeping secrets from me. Usually if she bought me a gift, I could tell within minutes. But this time she had somehow managed to keep whatever she was planning hidden for weeks. I went to bed that night thinking about the envelope. I tried not to imagine anything dramatic, but the next morning, Dinah woke me earlier than usual. "Get dressed," she said. "We're going somewhere." I asked where. She smiled again. "You're going to find out soon." We drove for almost an hour. I recognized the road only when we reached the outskirts of the town where I had spent the first years of my working life. Dana pulled into a parking lot and turned off the engine. I looked through the windshield and froze. Across the street stood the building where my entire career had started. I turned toward her. She simply handed me the envelope and said, "Now you can open it." I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the old building across the street, but the picture had been taken decades earlier, when the place looked completely different. I recognized myself immediately. I was standing outside the entrance, beside a younger version of Dana. I had forgotten that photograph existed. I turned it over and found a short handwritten message. "You said you wanted to see this place again someday." I looked at Dana. "I said that years ago." She nodded. I remembered. We crossed the street together. The building had changed owners several times, but the structure itself remained almost the same. I stood outside for a moment, remembering the man I had been when I first started working there. I was 24, ambitious, nervous, and convinced that hard work could solve almost every problem. Dana had been beside me even then. We had very little money, but we had dreams. We walked through the entrance, and I expected an empty office. Instead, I heard voices. I looked at Dana. She smiled. "Just keep walking." We entered a large room that had been decorated with photographs from my career. There were old colleagues, family friends, and several people I had not seen in years. I stood completely still. Robert walked toward me first. "Surprise, Dad." Millie came next and hugged me. "Happy anniversary." I looked at Dana. "You planned all this?" She nodded. "For months." I felt overwhelmed. I had never expected anything like it. People began sharing stories about my early working years. Some were funny, some embarrassing, and some made me realize how much time had passed. Then an old colleague named Martin approached me. We had worked together for nearly 15 years. He shook my hand and said, "Daniel, there's something else." He handed me a small wooden box. I opened it and found an old company badge with my name on it. I laughed. "I thought this was lost." Martin smiled. "Dana found it." I looked at her again. She had thought of everything. But then the room became quiet. Dana stepped forward and asked everyone to sit down. She stood beside me and said, "There is one more reason I brought Daniel here." I assumed she was going to talk about our anniversary. Instead, she looked at me and said, "Daniel spent his entire life building things for other people. He worked hard, sacrificed for our family, and never asked for much in return. But there is something he gave up years ago. She paused. His dream. I felt my throat tighten. Years earlier, I had wanted to start my own small construction company. I had abandoned the idea when Robert was born and our finances became difficult. I never talked about it because I thought that chapter of my life was over. Dana knew differently. She had spent months researching what it would take to restart that dream. Then she handed me another folder. Inside was a business proposal. She had arranged for me to meet with investors who believed in the project. I looked at her in disbelief. "Why would you do this?" She smiled. "Because you spent 30 years helping everyone else chase their dreams. I thought it was time someone helped you chase yours." For several seconds I couldn't speak. I looked through the folder again. There were financial projections, property information, plans for a small construction and renovation company, and even a list of potential clients. Dana had somehow researched everything without telling me. Robert had helped with the financial side, and Millie had apparently designed the first presentation. I asked them how long they had been planning it. Robert laughed. "Almost 8 months." I looked at Dana. "You kept this secret for 8 months?" She smiled. "I had motivation." I shook my head in disbelief. I had spent most of my adult life putting my family first. When I was younger, I worked long hours. When Robert was born, I took a second job for a while. When Millie started school, I made sure she had everything she needed. Eventually, my dream became something I told myself I no longer wanted. But standing in that old building, I realized that perhaps I had never stopped wanting it. I simply stopped allowing myself to think about it. The next morning, Dinah took me to meet the first investor. His name was Samuel, and he had known my work for years. He listened while I explained my idea. I expected him to ask about profit first, but instead he asked, "Why did you stop?" I told him the truth. "Because my family needed me." He nodded. "And now?" I looked at Dana, who was sitting behind me. "Now my family wants me to try again." Samuel smiled. "Then maybe it's time." Over the next few weeks, I started working on the plan. It was harder than I expected. Technology had changed. The industry had changed. I had to learn new systems and rethink how I approached projects. There were moments when I wondered if I was too old to start again. One evening, I told Dinah that perhaps the idea had been a mistake. She looked at me and said, "Daniel, I didn't give you a dream because I wanted you to become successful. I gave it back to you because I wanted you to remember who you were." Her words stayed with me. I continued. Robert helped me understand modern business tools. Millie handled some of the branding and presentation work. Dana became the person who reminded me not to give up whenever something went wrong. Eventually, we secured our first project. It was a small renovation of an old family-owned property. I walked onto the site on the first morning and felt 24 again. I was nervous, excited, and determined. The project went well. Then another opportunity came, and another. Within a year, the small company had grown beyond anything I had imagined. But just when I thought the surprise Dana had planned was finally complete, she told me there was something else. One evening, she came into my office holding a document. "Daniel," she said, "I think you should read this." I opened it and recognized the address immediately. It was the property where I had once dreamed of opening my first company. I looked at her in shock. "How did you get this?" She smiled. "I bought it." I stared at the document for several seconds. The property had been unavailable for years. I had stopped checking because I assumed someone else would eventually develop it. Dana had somehow managed to purchase it without me knowing. I asked her why she had gone that far. She answered, "Because this is where you said your dream should have started." I walked through the property the next morning. The building needed work, but I could see the possibilities immediately. I imagined offices, a workshop, a training area, and a place where young workers could learn the trade. I told Dana that I wanted the company to be more than a business. I wanted it to create opportunities for people who were willing to work but had never been given a chance. She agreed. We began renovating the property. Robert handled the business operations, while Millie helped organize community partnerships. Dana managed the financial planning. I focused on the construction work. For the first time in decades, our entire family was working toward the same goal. One afternoon, an elderly man walked onto the property. I recognized him immediately. His name was Harold, and he had been my supervisor when I was 24. He looked around and said, "I always knew you would come back." I laughed. "I never thought I would." Harold shook his head. "You were always building something, Daniel, even when you didn't realize it." His words reminded me of how much my life had changed. I had spent years believing that giving up a dream was the same as growing up. Now I understood that sometimes you simply postpone a dream until the right moment arrives. The renovation took nearly 6 months. When the building was finally ready, Dana organized another gathering. This time I knew something was happening, but I had no idea how big it would be. Employees, friends, family members, and several people from the community arrived. Dana stood beside me and announced that the company would sponsor training programs for young people entering construction and skilled trades. She said, Daniel spent years believing that success meant providing for his family. Today, he understands that success also means giving other people a chance to build something. Everyone applauded. I looked at Dana and realized the real surprise had never been the building or the business. It was that she had remembered a part of me that I had forgotten. Later that evening, I asked her why she had waited so long. She said, because I needed to know that you were ready. I asked, ready for what? She smiled. To believe that your life wasn't finished just because your children grew up. I looked across the room at Millie and Robert. They were laughing together. I realized she was right. For years, I had measured my life by what my family needed from me. Now I could measure it by what we could build together. But the biggest surprise was still waiting. Dana took my hand and said, Daniel, there's one more person you need to meet. A young man stepped forward. I recognized his face, but I couldn't remember from where. Then he introduced himself. My name is Ethan. My father worked with you many years ago. I suddenly remembered the family. Ethan's father had been one of the first people I worked with when I was young. His name was Thomas. I remembered him as a hard-working man who had taught me several valuable lessons about construction and business. Ethan explained that his father had passed away several years earlier, but before his death, he had left something for me. Ethan handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Thomas had written about the early years of my career and the dream I had once described to him. He had remembered that I wanted to build a company where workers were treated fairly and young people could learn without being judged for their background. I read the letter twice. Thomas had written that he believed I would eventually create that company, even if it took decades. I looked at Ethan and thanked him. Then I looked at Dana. You knew about this? She nodded. For months. I laughed. So the surprise keeps getting bigger. She smiled. I told you. The next year became one of the most meaningful periods of my life. Our company grew steadily, but we refused to expand too quickly. We wanted to maintain the values on which it had been built. We hired people based on their willingness to learn and work hard. We trained young workers who had little experience. We also created a program that allowed employees to continue their education while working. Robert became an excellent manager, but he never treated the company as something that belonged only to him. Millie eventually joined the organization part-time, helping with community programs and public relations. Dana remained the heart of the operation. Whenever I became too focused on numbers, she reminded me why we had started. One evening, I asked her whether she had ever worried that the plan would fail. She laughed. Every single day. I asked why she had never shown it. She replied, because you had spent enough years doubting yourself. I didn't want to add to that. I realized then that her surprise had never been about money. It had been about confidence. She had seen something in me that I had stopped seeing in myself. A few years later, we returned to the original building where she had first surprised me. We stood outside and looked at the photograph she had given me on that first day. I compared the younger Daniel in the photograph with the man standing beside her. I was older, certainly, but I didn't feel defeated by time anymore. I felt grateful for it. Dana asked me whether I regretted giving up the dream for so many years. I told her, no, if I had started earlier, I might never have built the family I have today. She smiled. That's the answer I was hoping for. Then Millie called us from across the street. She had brought Robert and the grandchildren. We all walked into the old building together. For a moment, I looked around and realized that my greatest achievement had never been the company. It was the people standing beside me. Yet Dana still had another surprise planned. She waited until everyone was together and then handed me a key, held the key in my hand and looked at Dana. What does this open? I asked. She smiled. You'll find out. We drove to a nearby property that I had never seen before. When we arrived, I noticed a sign outside the building with the name of our company. I turned toward Dana in disbelief. She said, "This is our training center." I walked inside and found classrooms, workshops, equipment, and photographs of the people who had helped us along the way. One wall carried a large photograph of my younger self working on a construction site. Underneath it were the words, "Start where you are. Build what you believe." I became emotional. Dana had transformed a dream I once considered impossible into something that could continue long after I was gone. She explained that the training center would provide scholarships and practical education for young people who wanted to learn skilled trades. Robert had helped secure funding. Millie had built partnerships with local organizations. Employees had volunteered their time. Everyone had been involved except me, because they wanted the opening to remain a surprise. I asked Dana why she had done all this. She said, "Because you taught us that a person's value isn't measured by what they own. It's measured by what they leave behind." I looked at my family and realized that the surprise had become much bigger than anything I could have imagined. That evening we held the opening ceremony. Several former colleagues attended, including Harold. He stood beside me and said, "You finally built it." I smiled. "We built it." He nodded. That's the difference between a man who has a dream and a family that believes in him. Millie gave a short speech about how her mother had secretly planned everything. Robert joked that he had nearly ruined the surprise 3 times. Everyone laughed. Then Dana came forward. She looked at me and said, "Daniel, when I first met you, you were a young man with nothing but ambition. Over the years, I watched you become a husband, a father, and eventually a man who forgot that he was allowed to have dreams too. I wanted to remind you." I took her hand. "You reminded me of something more important," I said. "You reminded me that dreams are better when they are shared." The crowd applauded, but I barely heard them. I was thinking about the old version of myself standing outside that first workplace decades earlier. He had no idea what life would bring. He didn't know about the difficult years, the children, the sacrifices, the disappointments, or the unexpected second chance. He only knew that he wanted to build something meaningful. Now, standing beside Dana, I understood that he had never truly lost that dream. It had simply changed shape. Later that night, after everyone left, Dana and I sat outside the training center. She asked, "So, were you surprised?" I laughed. "You have no idea." She leaned against me and said, "Good." I asked her whether there was finally nothing left to surprise me with. She looked at me with that familiar smile. "Maybe." I shook my head. "Dinah, I don't believe you anymore." She laughed. But then she became serious. "Daniel, there's something I've learned." I asked what. She said, "The best surprises aren't the things we receive. They're the things we realize we already had." Her words stayed with me. We sat there quietly, looking at the lights inside the training center. I thought about everything that had happened since. The day she placed that envelope on our kitchen table. At first, I had expected a simple anniversary surprise. Instead, she had given me something much more valuable, a reason to believe in myself again. The years that followed were not perfect. We had disagreements, business problems, unexpected expenses, and moments when the future felt uncertain. But we faced those things together. Dana and I learned that marriage was not about constantly surprising each other with grand gestures. It was about remembering the person beside you when life became complicated. Millie eventually built a successful career of her own. Robert became an important part of the company and eventually took over much of the daily management. I slowly reduced my working hours, but I never completely retired. I continued visiting the training center because I loved talking to the young people who came there. Sometimes they would ask me how I became successful. I always gave them the same answer. I made mistakes, I kept learning, and I had people who believed in me when I stopped believing in myself. Whenever they asked who those people were, I would point toward Dana if she happened to be nearby. Years after the original surprise, she and I returned to the same kitchen table. The house was quieter now. Millie lived in another city. Robert was busy with his family, and the rooms that had once been filled with children's voices were peaceful. Dana made 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me. She smiled and said, "Do you remember the first surprise?" I laughed. "The one that lasted for years?" She nodded. I told her that I still had the original photograph she had placed in the envelope. She asked why I had kept it. I answered, "Because it reminds me that sometimes someone else can see your future before you can." She reached across the table and held my hand. "I never wanted to change your life, Daniel. I just wanted to remind you that it belonged to you too." I looked at her and realized how lucky I was. Not because we had built a successful company. Not because we had earned more money than we once imagined. Not because our names were on a building. I was lucky because after 31 years of marriage, I was still sitting across from the woman who knew my younger self and had never stopped believing in the man I could become. When people ask me about the biggest surprise of my life, I never tell them about the property, the business, or the training center. I tell them about a simple sentence: "You're going to be surprised." Those words changed the direction of my life because they reminded me that the future can still contain possibilities, even when you think your most important years are behind you. Dana taught me that a dream can wait, a family can grow, a person can start again, and sometimes the best chapter of your life begins when you believe that chapter has already ended. I thought Dana was planning a surprise for one evening. Instead, she gave me a surprise that lasted the rest of my life. And whenever I look at her now, I understand what she was really trying to tell me all those years ago. The greatest surprises are not the things waiting for us somewhere in the future. They are the people who quietly believe in us until we finally learn to believe in ourselves again. If you like this video, response us by comment. Tell your places where you are looking from. It make me happy to see people from different places. And don't forget to subscribe channel for more videos.